In a crowded shopping mall, a well-dressed black elderly man, calm and composed, finds himself unjustly confronted by a group of officers who accuse him of theft. The officers' harsh behavior catches the attention of those nearby as they question him without any legitimate reason, creating a tense and escalating scene. Just when it seems like the situation is about to spiral out of control, Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, steps in. What happens next surprises everyone, as he takes action that completely shifts the course of events in a split second. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment below and let us know where you're joining us from. It was a typical afternoon at the mall. The crowd meandered between stores, chatting, laughing, and hunting for bargains. The air was filled with the familiar scent of coffee and pastries, while the sound of footsteps echoed on the polished floors. But for one man, this ordinary day was about to take an unexpected turn. Samuel Brown, a successful businessman in his late 60s, had come to the mall for a quick errand. Dressed in an impeccably tailored dark suit, his crisp white shirt tucked neatly into his jacket, he moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. His graying hair and well-groomed beard gave him the air of someone who had seen and overcome many challenges in life. Samuel had reached the pinnacle of success in his career, but his journey had not been without its struggles. Throughout his life, Samuel had faced countless obstacles, not just in business, but in navigating the subtle prejudices that came with being a black man in a society quick to judge based on appearances. From microaggressions to awkward glances and whispered conversations, he had experienced discrimination in both big and small ways. And today, as he walked through the mall, he would face it once again. As Samuel passed a clothing store, two officers stationed near the entrance took notice of him. They exchanged a glance, a shared sense of suspicion passing between them. There was something about Samuel that made them uneasy, although they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Without a second thought, they decided to follow him. They followed him through the store, their eyes fixed on his every movement, growing increasingly wary as he browsed the shelves. Samuel, unaware of their scrutiny, focused intently on a high-end jacket, admiring the meticulous design and quality of the fabric. It wasn't long before one of the officers approached him. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice even but tinged with underlying suspicion. Samuel turned slowly, startled, yet keeping his calm. "Yes?" Samuel replied, his tone courteous, though a faint weariness lingered in his words. "We need to inspect your bags," the officer stated, pointing to the small leather briefcase Samuel was holding. "There have been reports of theft here, and we need to ensure you're not involved." Samuel blinked, feeling a quick rush of adrenaline, not out of fear, but because he immediately understood what was happening. It was something he had encountered before, racial profiling. He exhaled deeply, knowing this moment would test both his patience and self-control. "I haven't taken anything," Samuel said evenly, his voice calm and measured. "Feel free to check my bag." The second officer moved closer, his expression doubtful, clearly not buying Samuel's words. "We'll decide that for ourselves." Before Samuel could respond, the officer grabbed the briefcase from his hand, yanking it open with no warning. His heart raced as his papers and documents tumbled out, but it wasn't the contents that left him feeling exposed. It was the officer's look. Suspicion was written all over his face, before he'd even looked inside the bag. The hum of the busy mall seemed to fade as Samuel worked to control his emotions. A small crowd had started to gather, murmurs spreading through the onlookers. The air grew heavier with tension, and Samuel felt his pulse beating faster. More officers began to converge, drawn by the growing commotion. But just as Samuel opened his mouth to explain or calm the situation, something unexpected occurred. "That's enough." A booming voice cut through the growing tension. The crowd parted, and in walked a man who commanded attention without even trying. The voice belonged to none other than Dwayne Johnson, the actor and philanthropist, known for his strength on screen and his kindness off it. He had just been shopping in the mall, but upon hearing the commotion, he couldn't ignore what was happening. Dwayne's eyes locked onto the scene immediately. "Sir, let him go," Dwayne said in his usual deep, commanding tone, walking directly toward the officers. The officers froze, not sure how to react. Dwayne Johnson wasn't just another celebrity. he was an icon. But more than that, he had seen this kind of injustice far too many times in his life, and he was not going to stand by and let it happen here, not in front of him, not to Samuel. "Dwayne?" Samuel said, blinking in disbelief, his mind still catching up with what was happening. Dwayne stood between Samuel and the officers, his massive frame blocking any further action from the law enforcement. He looked directly at the officer who had started the confrontation. "Sir," Dwayne said firmly, "I understand you have a job to do, but what I'm seeing here is beyond the scope of your duties. You have no reason to treat this man like a criminal, and if you think you can just intimidate people for no reason, you're gravely mistaken." The officers hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Dwayne's intervention. The crowd, once quiet and nervous, now started murmuring, some looking to Samuel and others to Dwayne. The shift in energy was palpable. The whole scene was charged with anticipation. But Dwayne wasn't done. He turned toward Samuel, giving him a reassuring nod, as if telling him that he was not alone in this fight. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, Dwayne pulled out his phone and started filming the scene, documenting everything. He was going to make sure this wasn't swept under the rug. The officers were now visibly uncomfortable. The crowd's gaze was no longer on Samuel, but on them. The power dynamic was shifting, and the officers could feel it. In a swift motion, one of them signaled to the others to back off. "Just go," the officer muttered, clearly shaken by Dwayne's presence and the growing attention. Dwayne didn't let up, though. "Make sure you treat everyone with respect," he said firmly. "And remember, no one is above the law, not even you." As the officers retreated, Samuel stood there, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of the moment was heavy, but the feeling of relief was equally profound. He turned to Dwayne, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly. "You just saved me from something much bigger than this." Dwayne smiled, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "No one should go through what you just did. But remember, it's not just about today. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening. We've got your back." The crowd, which had been watching in silence, now erupted into applause. For the first time that day, Samuel felt like he could breathe freely, like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a man who had been seen, truly seen, and defended by someone who understood. But what happened next would reveal that this moment was just the beginning of something much larger. Something that would change both Samuel's life and the lives of others forever. The tension in the mall was palpable, but the moment Dwayne Johnson intervened, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The officers retreated, and Samuel's heart slowly returned to a steady rhythm. For a brief moment, the chaos had stopped, and in its place was a strange, surreal calm. Dwayne looked over at Samuel, who was still in shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Dwayne's towering frame loomed over him, but there was no arrogance or pride in his posture, just the quiet reassurance of a man who knew what it meant to stand up for what was right. "You okay?" Dwayne asked, his voice soft yet firm, as though checking in with a friend he'd known for years, rather than a stranger. Samuel nodded slowly, swallowing hard. He'd been through a lot in his life, but nothing had quite prepared him for a public humiliation like this. He had been profiled, judged, and treated with suspicion for something he hadn't done. It wasn't just the officer's actions, it was the reality that had followed him for years. The unfair, unjust prejudices that people like him faced every day. But now, in this surreal moment, Dwayne Johnson had stepped in like a guardian angel, and it left him speechless. "Thank you," Samuel finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Dwayne offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, still buzzing with energy from the confrontation. "This should never have happened in the first place." The two of them stood there for a few moments, the weight of the experience slowly sinking in. Samuel felt a sense of gratitude, but also an overwhelming sadness. It wasn't just the officers that he had to contend with, it was the system, the world that had always viewed him through a lens of prejudice. As they began to walk out of the store, Dwayne offered to escort Samuel to his car. The idea of walking back into the crowd, knowing that everyone had witnessed the encounter, left Samuel with an odd mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to hide, to escape the spotlight, but Dwayne's calm, assured presence was a comforting balm. With a simple nod, Samuel agreed. "Let's get some air, man," Dwayne said. "It's been a long day, and I can tell you've got a lot on your mind." As they walked toward the exit, Samuel's thoughts began to wander. He had built an empire from the ground up, using every ounce of his strength and ingenuity to get where he was today. But no matter how successful he became, there was always that invisible wall of discrimination. It never truly went away. He could buy the finest clothes, drive the most expensive cars, and live in the most exclusive neighborhoods. But none of that protected him from the biases people harbored because of the color of his skin. Dwayne, sensing the gravity of the moment, continued speaking, though his words were deliberate and calm. "You know, this kind of thing, it's not new. It's not even just about race. It's about how people in power use their position to make others feel small. It's how some people believe that because they have a badge or because they have money, they have the right to treat others like they're not human." Samuel's mind raced. Dwayne was right. He'd faced that judgment his entire life, not just from strangers but from people in positions of authority who saw him as less than or unworthy of basic respect. "But," Dwayne added, his tone shifting slightly, "what they don't realize is that karma always has a way of balancing things out. People like us, we don't just get knocked down, we get back up, and when we do, we stand stronger than before." Samuel turned to look at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I hope you're right," he said quietly. "It's just hard to believe sometimes, you know?" Dwayne patted him on the back, a warm gesture that felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 shared struggles. "I know it's hard, but trust me, it's not over. Karma doesn't forget, and neither do we." As they reached the parking lot, Samuel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his wife, asking how things were going. Samuel hadn't told her about the confrontation at the mall, knowing that she would worry. But as he read her message, something inside him shifted. He had worked so hard his entire life, building a life for himself, his wife, and their children. But this moment felt like a turning point. It wasn't just about the wealth or the success. It was about making sure that the next generation, his children, wouldn't have to face the same prejudice, the same injustice. And it was about standing up for others, even when it was difficult. As they got into his car, Dwayne looked at him one last time. "Listen, Samuel, you've got a story to tell. People need to hear it. Don't let moments like today be forgotten. Don't let your voice be silenced." Samuel felt the weight of Dwayne's words. He had always kept a low profile, choosing to work quietly and let his success speak for itself. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to speak out, to take a stand. As they parted ways, Samuel felt a new sense of purpose ignite within him. His story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, everyone who had been made to feel small, everyone who had been silenced. He had a voice, and it was time to use it. The next few days were a blur for Samuel. The encounter at the mall and Dwayne Johnson's intervention seemed to be the talk of the town. News outlets covered the story, and people on social media were buzzing about how a celebrity had stepped in to stop racial profiling. But while the public attention was intense, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had been given a second chance, a public platform. But what was he supposed to do with it? As he sat in his office that evening, looking out at the skyline, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. Dwayne's words still echoed in his mind. "You've got a story to tell. People need to hear it." It wasn't just a matter of telling his story. It was about the greater fight, the larger purpose that had been building inside him for years. Samuel's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see his assistant, Rachel, standing in the doorway. "Mr. Brown, there's someone here to see you," she said, a slight hesitation in her voice. "It's a reporter. She says it's urgent." Samuel was used to reporters wanting to speak with him about his business dealings, but this felt different. The urgency in Rachel's voice told him this wasn't about a business deal. It was about something far more personal. "Send her in," he said, rising from his desk. Moments later, a woman walked into the room. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a professional blazer and slacks, her short hair neatly tucked behind her ears. She had an air of calm confidence, the kind of woman who had seen and heard it all before. "Mr. Brown, thank you for taking the time to meet with me," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Hannah Carter. I'm a reporter for the National News Network." Samuel shook her hand, a polite smile on his face. "Of course, Miss Carter. What can I help you with?" Hannah didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm sure you've heard that the story of your encounter with the officers at the mall is all over the media, but I'm here because I believe there's more to your story than what the public's seeing. I want to know the truth behind the man who was profiled that day. What does this moment mean to you?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he considered brushing her off, telling her it wasn't the right time, that he didn't have anything more to add. But as he looked into her earnest eyes, he realized she wasn't just after a headline. She was after the truth. "I've spent my life hiding parts of who I am," Samuel began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I've built a successful business empire, but I've always had to carry this invisible weight. As a black man in this world, I've had to fight harder, prove myself more, and even then, I'm judged by the color of my skin before anything else." Hannah nodded, scribbling notes quickly, but there was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. "Racial profiling, prejudice, it's been my reality for as long as I can remember. But the thing is, it's not just the blatant acts of racism we deal with. It's the little things. The looks, the assumptions, the way you're treated like you don't belong, even when you've earned your place." Samuel paused, his thoughts swirling. He'd never shared his story like this before, but something about this moment, this opportunity to speak out, felt different. He felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for years. "When that officer stopped me in the mall, I knew exactly what was happening. I've had it happen before, but that's the thing, right? It's not supposed to be happening anymore. We've come so far, but there's still this deep-rooted bias, this systemic racism that continues to rear its ugly head in places we least expect. And people like me, we're the ones who pay the price." Hannah's pen slowed, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face as he spoke. "But you had someone with you that day. Dwayne Johnson. It's rare to see someone like him step up for someone like you in such a public way. How did that moment change things for you?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes momentarily unfocused as he recalled the events of that day. Dwayne's intervention was nothing short of extraordinary. I was shocked, honestly, but he didn't just help me in that moment. He reminded me of something important, that we have a responsibility to stand up for each other, to use our voices. He told me karma has a way of balancing things out. And I believe that. I believe this moment is part of a bigger picture. As the conversation continued, Samuel's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the road ahead. He had spent his life building his legacy, but now it was time to build something even more meaningful. He was no longer just fighting for his own success. He was fighting for change, fighting to break down the walls of prejudice that had been erected around him, around so many others. The interview wrapped up, but Hannah's words lingered. "Mr. Brown, the world needs to hear your story. It's not just about the injustice you faced, it's about the change you can inspire. You're not just a businessman anymore. You're a voice for people who have been silenced for too long." That evening, after the interview was done, Samuel sat in his study, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He could feel the shift in himself. The decision had been made. He was no longer going to let his story be a passive one, told by others. He was going to take control of his narrative. He was going to speak out, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. His phone buzzed again, a message from Dwayne. "I saw the interview. You did great, brother. Keep pushing." Samuel smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He was ready to stand tall, ready to fight, ready to lead others in the battle for justice and equality. The weeks following Samuel's interview were nothing short of transformative. News outlets ran his story, sharing the details of his encounter with the officers and his subsequent decision to speak out against racial profiling. Social media was ablaze with support, but it was the mixed reactions that Samuel wasn't prepared for. the polarized responses that came from all corners of the world. Some hailed him as a hero, applauding his courage for exposing the injustices he'd faced. Others criticized him for drawing attention to his own experience, accusing him of playing the race card in a world that was past all of that. The backlash was swift, and though Samuel expected some pushback, it stung deeper than he anticipated. It was one thing to face racial profiling in person. It was another to be judged and vilified for simply speaking the truth. But in the midst of the controversy, something unexpected happened. The first call came on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. Samuel had just returned home from an exhausting day of meetings when his assistant, Rachel, buzzed him on the intercom. "Mr. Brown, there's a Mrs. Thompson here to see you. She says it's urgent." "Send her in," Samuel replied, surprised to see anyone at this hour. Moments later, a woman in her 50s entered his office, her face a mixture of determination and concern. She was dressed simply, in a black skirt and white blouse, but there was an undeniable strength in her presence. She didn't waste any time with small talk. "Mr. Brown, I'm Christine Thompson," she began, sitting down across from him. "I've been following your story, and I need your help." Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "My help? I'm not sure what I can do for you." Christine didn't hesitate. "I'm the mother of one of the officers who was involved in that incident at the mall. I've seen what it's done to him, to our family. He's been ashamed, hiding from his own actions, and I don't know how to fix it. But maybe, just maybe, you can help him find redemption." The words hit Samuel like a wave. He'd never expected someone like Christine to walk into his office, not as an adversary, but as a woman desperate to heal the wounds her son had caused. It was a moment that made him reconsider everything he'd believed about revenge, justice, and forgiveness. "I don't understand," Samuel said, leaning forward. "Why should I help the man who caused me all this pain?" Christine's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. Because he didn't act out of malice. He acted out of ignorance, out of what he had been taught. And now he sees the error of his ways. He's come to me, asking for forgiveness, asking for a chance to make things right. But he doesn't know where to begin. He doesn't know how to atone for what he's done. Samuel was silent for a moment, his thoughts swirling. The world had taught him that there was no room for compassion for people who had wronged him. But Christine's words dug deep into his heart. She wasn't asking for Samuel to forget what had happened or to forgive her son blindly. She was asking for a chance for her son to make amends, and that, Samuel realized, was a rare thing. "I can't promise anything," Samuel finally said, his voice softer now. "But I'll talk to him. If he's truly remorseful, if he's willing to change, then maybe we can find a way forward." Christine nodded, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time, Samuel saw the humanity behind the badge. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about healing. About breaking the cycle of prejudice and hatred that had plagued both their lives. The second call came a few days later, this time from Officer James Miller, the very man who had been involved in Samuel's confrontation at the mall. Samuel agreed to meet him at a neutral location, an old quiet cafe not far from his office. When Samuel arrived, he saw James sitting at a corner table, his uniform now replaced with plain clothes, his demeanor unrecognizable from the confident, almost arrogant officer who had once treated Samuel like a criminal. James stood as Samuel approached, his hands slightly shaking as he offered a handshake. "Mr. Brown," he said, his voice faltering. "I know you probably don't want to be here, but I need to speak with you. I need to apologize." Samuel sat down across from him, his heart heavy. "Go ahead." "I've spent days thinking about what happened that day," James continued, his eyes filled with regret. "At the time, I was just doing my job, but I didn't stop to think about how my actions would affect you. I didn't see you for who you were, a man with a story, a life. I saw you as someone to control. And I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry for that." Samuel remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight of the officer's words. Was this real? Was this apology sincere, or just another attempt at damage control? It was hard to say, but as he looked into James's eyes, he saw a man who was genuinely broken. He had made a mistake, a big one, and now he was trying to find a way to make it right. "Why now?" Samuel asked, his voice steady. "Why come to me now?" James swallowed hard, looking down at the table. "Because I've been haunted by it. I've been haunted by what I did, and by the way people like you are treated every day. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I want to be part of the solution." There was a long pause before Samuel spoke again. "I can't just forget what happened. It's not that simple. But I believe people can change. Maybe you have a chance to be a part of that change." James's face softened with relief. "Thank you. I won't let you down." As Samuel walked out of the cafe, he felt a sense of closure. The encounter hadn't erased the pain, but it had opened the door to something more profound: understanding, accountability, and perhaps a small step toward healing. The ripple effect had begun. James Miller wasn't just an officer who had wronged him. He was now part of the conversation, part of the movement for change. The days following Samuel's meeting with Officer James Miller were filled with reflection. While the public story continued to unfold, Samuel's internal transformation was just beginning. The backlash and the praise, the support and the criticism, they had all become a distant hum in the background of a greater, more important truth he had discovered. It wasn't just about making noise, it was about making a difference. Samuel knew that he had a choice to make. He could go back to his life of quiet influence, using his wealth and power behind the scenes, or he could truly live out the values he had always tried to embody in his personal and professional life. He had spoken out against injustice, but now it was time to take action. Action that could ripple out into the community and beyond. But just as he was finding clarity, something unexpected happened that would challenge his resolve. It was a bright Saturday morning when he got the call. He had just finished breakfast when his assistant Rachel, her voice tense with urgency, told him to check the news. The story wasn't about him this time, but it was tied to everything he had been fighting for. A new incident of racial profiling had occurred at a different shopping center, and the young man involved was now receiving widespread attention. The young man, an aspiring musician named Malik, had been wrongfully accused of shoplifting because of the color of his skin. Like Samuel's encounter with the officers, Malik's story was quickly becoming a flashpoint, with people online rallying behind him and activists demanding accountability from the police department. But what stood out to Samuel most was the raw footage that had been captured of the incident. Malik, only 22, had fought back in a way that made him seem more defiant than scared. His defiance had been interpreted by the officers as aggression, and they reacted with overwhelming force. The situation had escalated quickly, leading to Malik's injury. While Samuel knew that what Malik had experienced was wrong, he also understood something far more profound now. He was no longer just a spectator. His responsibility had grown. Rachel's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Samuel, I think it's time. We need to do something about this." Without a word, Samuel stood and walked over to his bookshelf, pulling out a file labeled Community Outreach. He had always known that his position in society gave him influence, but it had never occurred to him to leverage it in such a way that could inspire real, systemic change. Now, he knew what he had to do. That afternoon, Samuel called a press conference. This time, however, it wasn't about his own story. It was about Malik's. He didn't just want to draw attention to what had happened. He wanted to be part of the solution. With the news cameras pointed in his direction, Samuel addressed the audience. "The fight for equality is not a battle for one person to fight alone," Samuel began, his voice strong and unwavering. "It's a collective effort, and we must all be involved. Malik's story is just one example of the larger systemic issues we're facing, and if we don't take action, it will continue to happen." The room fell silent as Samuel's words sank in. "I am announcing the launch of a new initiative," he continued, one focused on supporting victims of racial profiling, offering both legal assistance and emotional support to those who have been wrongfully accused. This initiative will also partner with law enforcement agencies to promote education on racial bias and how we can work together to ensure that incidents like Malik's never happen again. The response was immediate, with applause echoing through the room. But Samuel knew that the true work was just beginning. As the days passed, Samuel's new initiative quickly garnered support from a range of influential figures: activists, community leaders, and even other celebrities. The movement gained momentum, and with it, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility grow. But what had begun as a reaction to one man's injustice was now evolving into a larger conversation about society's treatment of black men and women, and about the responsibility of those with power to create change. At the heart of this movement was not just a desire to hold the system accountable, but to heal, to foster understanding, to create a space where dialogue could flourish instead of division. But the breakthrough moment came when Malik himself appeared at the next press conference, standing alongside Samuel. With his arms still in a sling from the injuries he'd sustained, Malik spoke to the crowd, his voice steady despite the pain. "I don't want to be a symbol of what's wrong with the system. I just want to be seen for who I am. I want to live in a world where my skin color doesn't define me, where my dreams aren't judged by the color of my skin," he said. Samuel Brown didn't have to step in for me, but he did. And that's the kind of ally we need. Someone who not only stands with us, but who believes in us. Thank you, Samuel. The applause that followed was louder than any that had come before, and as Samuel looked out at the crowd, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just for himself, but for Malik, for the community, and for the countless others who would now have a voice. Weeks later, a follow-up article would be published, detailing the impact of Samuel's initiative. It wasn't just a legal project. It had become a beacon of hope for those fighting against racial injustice. Stories of people who had once felt invisible were now being heard. They were no longer isolated in their pain. They were united in their cause. But even more than that, the ripple effect of Samuel's actions began to take root in the hearts of the community. As more individuals came forward to share their experiences, the initiative became a platform for collective healing. Together, they began to challenge the narratives that had long been used to justify racial profiling, shifting the conversation from blame to understanding, from separation to unity. And then, as if to confirm that change was possible, Samuel received an unexpected message. It was from Officer James Miller. "I've been listening. I've been learning. I don't have all the answers, but I want to be a part of this. Can I help?" The message brought a deep sense of calm to Samuel. It wasn't a full circle, but it was a significant step, a sign that even the most hardened hearts could change, that even the most unlikely people could come together for a better future. As the story drew to a close, Samuel looked back on everything that had transpired. The path he had walked hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been without sacrifice. But it had been worth it, because in the end, he hadn't just changed his own life. He had changed the lives of countless others, and inspired a generation to fight not just for themselves, but for each other. If you enjoyed the story of Samuel's incredible journey and Malik's rise from adversity, be sure to check out the next story of transformation. Click here to watch it. Thank you for being part of this powerful story. And remember, real change starts with one voice, one action. Let's keep the conversation going.